Hello everybody, welcome to our webinar today, New Paradigms in Enterprise Risk Management. I'm Simon Marvel, CEO and founder of Acuity Risk Management. We're a London-based provider of GRC software and services through our Stream integrated risk management platform. Just for my background on me, before starting Acuity, I ran a consulting firm, Insight Consulting, which specialized in information and cyber risk management, business continuity, and enterprise risk management. Delighted to be joined today by Michael Rasmussen. I'm sure that most of you will know Michael already, but for those of you who don't, Michael's an internationally recognized pundit on GRC, governance, risk management and compliance, with specific expertise on the topics of enterprise GRC, GRC technology, corporate compliance and policy management. With over 27 years of experience, Michael helps organizations improve GR processes, design and implement GRC architecture, and select technologies that are effective, efficient, and agile. He's a sought-after keynote speaker, author, and advisor, and is noted as the father of GRC, being the first to define and model the GRC market in February 2002, while he was working at the analyst firm Forrester. This webinar is actually the second in a series of 4 that we're running. The first, Agile and Cognitive GRC, in the context of a dynamic business, was presented 3 weeks ago, and this is available on demand via our website if you would like to listen in. We received some very good questions, had a great discussion, and had very good feedback after that session, so please feel free to listen to that if you missed it. In 3 weeks' time, Michael and I will again be presenting, this time on delivering business and operational resiliency in 2021 and beyond, looking at an integrated approach to enterprise and operational risk management with business continuity and planning. And these 3 webinars, the first 3, are all thought leadership pieces with Michael. The 4th webinar, for those of you that are interested, is going to be based around a demonstration of our Stream platform. We've called that the future of GRC, Stream in Action. That will bring to life some of the topics that we've been talking about in the earlier parts of the series. But for these first 3 webinars, they're very much thought leadership. Hope you enjoy them. Please do feel free to put your questions in on the portal. We'll allow time for discussion and to answer your questions. So great opportunity to ask Michael if you have some questions that you would like to put in. The agenda then, just following my short introduction, I'll hand over to Michael. He's going to present to us today for about 30 minutes, I think, and then we'll have a discussion around some of the key points, the topics that were covered in the presentation. I'll then talk a little bit about further resources available to support this webinar, and then, as I said, we'll leave time at the end for a Q&A session. One further request, when you leave the webinar, the survey form will pop up. Be very grateful if you could complete this, give us your feedback, provide any suggestions for perhaps future webinar content. That'll help us to shape our next webinar series. So with that short introduction, I'll pass over now to Michael and let him begin.
Thank you, Simon. It is a pleasure to be here today, and I'm looking forward to this next virtual hour, whether you're on the live broadcast or in the on-demand, interacting and sharing my thoughts on enterprise risk management and the new paradigms that we're seeing in this area. So in that context, I'd encourage you again to use the chat if you're in the live webinar to be able to ask your questions, but I'll have my contact information up on one of the slides, and you can email me questions too if you're watching this on the on-demand format. There we go. So new paradigms in enterprise risk management, and as Simon introduced me, but I'll just give you a little bit of context. My job is research. I don't like to call myself a consultant, but I do provide an advisory type capacity. But sometimes that advisory capacity is to other consultants. I interact a lot with like the big 4 and what's going on in the market. I prefer to call myself a researcher, an analyst. So my job is to understand what are the challenges organizations facing? What's keeping the organization up at night, and the different roles of risk, compliance, ethics, and security, and so forth. And how are they going about solving those challenges with strategy, process, and technology? And so my job is to research and write, and in that context also speak like we're doing today. Now, enterprise risk is one of the fascinations I have in this area of research that I focus on. And so in that context, I spend a lot of time in risk management. I do a lot of work with the Institute of Risk Management out of London, which is a global organization, but has its headquarters there in London. I'm their global ambassador, one of their global ambassadors for risk management, and honorary life member for the Institute of Risk Management. So, I roll the sleeves and try to get deep into my research and understanding of what's changing in the world of enterprise and operational risk, and how can we prepare for that? So in that context, it was just a year ago that I wrote a paper. It was, well, actually over a year ago. It was October 2019, so before 2020 hit us with the COVID-19. And I wrote a paper in the Enterprise Risk magazine by the Institute of Risk Management called Navigating Chaos. And it's available on my website as well as in the Institute of Risk Management. But it's just how we're in this world that's changing minute by minute, second by second. Organizations today are about managing chaos. There's so much uncertainty around us. And we look at the proper definition of risk and risk management, and we unfold things in the ISO 31000 risk management standard. ISO 31000 defines risk as risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And so in that context, we're trying to manage uncertainty, and we're trying to do that in a chaotic world. Today's business is not defined by brick and mortar walls or traditional employees. Simon and I were just talking about this before the webinar started, on the whole area of third-party risks, and how the modern organization is this extended enterprise, and enterprise risk management goes across these relationships. In fact, I was talking to a global automobile manufacturer recently, and how they're restructuring their enterprise risk program because their risks cannot be defined, their internal risk cannot be defined with traditional employees and brick and mortar business. Okay, you walk down the halls, you sit in corporate offices and conference rooms when we're not in lockdowns, that is, and half the people that you come across and interact with are contractors, consultants, outsourcers, service providers, temporary workers, and more. And so we have to be able to manage risk across third-party relationships. We have to manage a changing regulatory risk landscape where new regulations and enforcement actions are continuously barraging the organization, and an external risk environment of shifting geopolitical risks and everything else. And what I find is that a lot of enterprise risk management programs are unbalanced. They don't really understand the intricate nature of risk. You look at Leonardo da Vinci. He said, realize that everything connects to everything else. We have what we consider chaos theory. Several years ago, I was doing a presentation on risk management that was being hosted at the Royal Society there in London. It wasn't a Royal Society event, that'd be really neat, but it was just using the venue there. It was really interesting because I was in this beautiful room with all these oak panels around me, and there's all these portraits of scientists around the room. And they're all very, regular, real-looking portraits, except for the one on my far right. It was extremely abstract around the edges and more real in the center. And I said, wow, I need to look up what that person's about. And it was a scientist that invented the chaos theory. And that's what I call the chaos of risk interconnectedness. And chaos theory is where you have the flutter of a butterfly's wings that makes tiny atmospheric changes that has this cascading and growing impact that can influence the development and path of a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. That's the challenge of business today in navigating chaos and dealing with chaos theory, is the flutter of the butterfly's wings. Those little things in the business cascade, matter, and have significant impacts, and they intersect and grow with other risks to become more significant risks. And we need to be able to understand and see that. In fact, the physicist Fritjof Capra stated, the more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they are interconnected and interdependent. We need to be able to see, just as, again, Simon and I were just talking about this before the webinar, a 360-degree view of risk. And that we need contextual intelligence and insight, a holistic view of risk that goes completely around us. Yeah, and an example of chaos theory and this interconnectedness of risk where the physicist here was talking about, well, the physicist himself was talking about biological ecosystems, but it applies to risk management very well today. But we have to see this interconnected nature of risk, a 360-degree view. And for example, COVID-19 is a great illustration. What starts off with a health and safety risk, say that orange thread above us, intersects and creates increased IT security risk in the home office environment. And I look around me and my, speakers connected to the internet, my wall outlets are connected to the internet, my TV's connected to the internet, my blender down in my kitchen is connected. I can program it with my iPhone. I have no idea why I would want to program my blender with my iPhone, but I could. Now, if any of those devices have a Trojan horse or some type of vulnerability, that could expose my home office network, which could expose client and kind of network data that I've got and network connections I have. That's significant. And now we're in this home office environment because of COVID-19. We have all this home office exposures. And you're thinking Trojan horse, right? Well, look at the SolarWinds example and how a Trojan horse has compromised over 200, very significant large organizations, including government agencies. It's real. But it's not just that yellow thread of home office IT security. You've got that, brown thread of increased hacker activity. You've got that black thread coming in below, that is about increased bribery and corruption risk. As there's restricted and reduced number of contracts available and restrictions on import and export and shipping, there's increased risk of bribery and corruption, that somebody might bribe a foreign government official for a contract or to expedite goods through customs. You have increased risk of fraud, which could be that green thread, that light green thread, that with tougher economic times, there's more, the good employees that you normally do bad things might decide to cheat a little and do the wrong thing. So we have increased fraud risk. We have increased resiliency risk of the organization. We have increased, risk of even, harassment and discrimination and things like that. We're in Zoom meetings and instead of corporate conference rooms, and I'm finding that in Zoom meetings, people might be wearing their dress shirts in the meeting, but they're wearing their pajamas, pants underneath the desk or the table, and they're very relaxed and casual, and they're saying things in these business meetings, corporate meetings, but they're in their home office environment, and they're saying things that would never be allowed. And we're seeing increased risk of things like harassment and discrimination because people are in their home office environment and don't realize the same rules apply. I can go on and on and on here, but what starts off with one risk of health and safety in COVID-19 intersects and creates greater risk exposure and all these other risks too as the organization adapts. We have to see a 360-degree view of risk. One story that I love going through that illustrates this is the story of the Titanic. Captain E.J. Smith stated, before the Titanic set sail, "I never saw a wreck and never have been wrecked, nor was I ever in a predicament that threatened to end in a disaster. I cannot conceive of any vital disaster happening to this vessel." Captain E.J. Smith is also stating that not even God can sink this ship. Overconfidence in a ship's design. That's one element. Then the front page of the newspaper said the Titanic was unsinkable, yet it sank on its maiden voyage. You have overconfidence in the CEO of the ship, the captain, E.J. Smith, overconfidence by the public, that the Titanic was unsinkable. You had to push to get across the Atlantic quickly to show its speed and power of the day. How often are we pushing business faster than it can be resilient and agile in that environment? Sometimes we push business so fast it fails. There's environmental risks with the Titanic. It just so happens in 1912 that there's some type of global warming, climate change already happening at that point, and the northern Arctic ice shelf is breaking up and icebergs are coming further south into the Atlantic. Not only that, the tidal moon poles of January, February, March 1912 were of a stronger nature that year that was bringing those icebergs further into the shipping lanes, south into the shipping lanes, creating more hazards of icebergs than were normally there. External environmental factors. Our business operates in external environment as well, and there's constantly shifting geopolitical risks, environmental risks, economic and market force risks, and other things we have to adapt to. The Titanic had health and safety risks. There wasn't a proper number of life preservers and lifeboats for the number of passengers on board. They were compliant with the health and safety laws of their day, and the disaster changed those laws. But you do the math, and there wasn't the right amount of safety equipment. They tell us that the size of the propeller and rudder were undersized for the massive size of the ship. It wasn't as navigable in the waters. I mean, this could be easily seen as the same of like liquidity and cash risk in the organization. Do we have enough cash and liquidity to steer the organization, be agile? And then, third-party risks. The Titanic had it. It just so happens that the seams of the ship that hold the various seams of the ship together, the rivets used in those seams was of a brittle, the iron ore in those rivets was of a brittle and inferior quality. And when it hit the iceberg, those seams of the ship ripped wide open and the ship sank. And so third-party risks, just as you have suppliers and vendors and outsourcers, service providers, the Titanic had that brittle iron ore that was used in the rivets of the ship. The oversight functions, we talk about second and third line functions. The Titanic had that in the sense that they had those people up in the cockpit that would look for disasters of the Titanic and things, hazards to navigate. Well, it just so happened that the Titanic was getting telegraphs from other ships, warnings, ships in the area. One of the responses back from the Titanic was, "Shut up, we're tired of hearing about it." Seriously, that was a reply back from the Titanic was, "Shut up, we're tired of hearing about it." How often are we being told? I mean, pandemic, good night, look at the pandemic. I get all of my soapbox and people say that this was a black swan event. The pandemic was not a black swan event. We've had pandemics before. I mean, I'm a student of medieval history. I mean, I love medieval history. If you saw my room, you'd see a medieval sword behind me. I got piles of books on medieval history on my desk here. We've had the Black Plague and bubonic plague and all these other plagues throughout history. We had the Spanish flu in 1912. We've had SARS and others in the last 20 years. Now. And on top of that, we have the World Economic Forum report that's been talking about pandemic risks for a decade or more. And in fact, before the pandemic even happened in December 2019, I wrote a blog article called A Tale of Two Futures. Is our future a Blade Runner future or a Star Trek future? We're headed one towards the other. And I said a lot of enterprise risk management programs are unbalanced because they're overly focused on IT security. IT security is a huge risk. I don't deny that. I spent the beginning of my career in the 1990s focused on IT risk. But you look at the enterprise and operational risk management programs and you think that IT risk was predominantly the only risk organizations face. And I called that out in that blog article and said, these enterprise and operational risk management strategies need to be more balanced. To be able to see the range of health and safety risks. And I pointed to the World Economic Forum report. But, the Titanic had this oversight function. They had the response, shut up, we're tired of hearing about it. That's how organizations have reacted to things like the World Economic Forum Global Risks Report. Right, environmental risk, our business doesn't need to worry about that. Health and safety risk, pandemic, we don't need to be worried about that. Then along comes 2020 to prove the point. But the Titanic showed ignorance. Ignorance is a big risk in organizations. The Titanic also had technology to scan the ocean for hazards like icebergs. Back in 1912, this technology was called binoculars. But it happened that the crew member that had the keys to the cabinet where the binoculars were kept was assigned duty to another ship right before it set sail and took the keys with them. And so they couldn't access and use the technology that they had, binoculars. Lastly, the ship, the Titanic, was headed towards an iceberg. If it would have just hit it dead on, only 2 compartments was flooded. It was designed to stay afloat with 4 compartments flooded. We're going to try to navigate around the iceberg. Remember, it had a small propeller and rudder, so it was not as navigable in the waters. And it brushed against the side. 6 compartments flooded. And just remember that side is held together by rivets that were of an inferior iron ore in quality, and they just ripped wide open. And 6 compartments flooded, and the ship sank. But it sank slowly. There's time to get people off the boat, but they didn't have the safety equipment. As an interconnected risk environment, just like the physicist Fritjof Capra stated in the previous slide, that we have these interconnected, it's an interconnected environment. We need to be able to see the big picture of risks in the organization to be able to adequately address risk in the organization. So, Teddy Roosevelt a US president from over 100 years ago. He said, risk is like fire. If controlled, it will help you. If uncontrolled, it will rise up and destroy you. Risk is a tool. We take risks, to make money and bring return to the organization, but risk can also bring hazard and harm. John Paul Jones, he's a famous Revolutionary War naval hero in the U.S. fight for independence against our Great Britain. And in that context, at the time, United Kingdom, at the time, Great Britain, I'm sorry, but against Great Britain. And John Paul Jones is known for beating up a larger British frigate. And he said, I have not yet begun to fight, and turned around and won that battle. But he also said, it is a law of nature, inflexible and inexorable, that those who do not risk do not win. Risk is part of life. Risk is part of war. Risk is part of business. To be able to advance and do things, you have to take risk. Those who do not risk do not win. But are we taking the right risks? That's the key question. Judge Mervyn Keane, the author of the Keane 1, 2, and now Keane 3 reports on corporate governance in South Africa, he said, enterprise is the undertaking of risk for reward. Translating from British Commonwealth Queen's English to US English, businesses take risks to make money. Risk is part of business, but the question is, are we taking the right risks, and how is that being managed? Risk management is about managing uncertainty in the context of the organization's objectives. They can be entity level objectives, they can be division objectives, department, process, project, or even asset level objectives. We're trying to manage uncertainty to those objectives, and that's the key thing that we're dealing with. But in that context of trying to manage that uncertainty and risk, the organization has to be able to see the tree as well as the forest, that individual risk as well as the interconnectedness of risk and objectives. Now, when I present this in my risk management by design workshops that I teach around the world when there's no global lockdown, I'm told that people love this slide, but I've been challenged on it twice, both by large banks, once in San Francisco and once in London. They said the same thing in different workshops, different banks. They said, great slide, I like the concept of the tree and the forest, but the reality in our organization is we got to not only see the tree, we have to see the leaves and the branches. I mean, that gets back to the whole butterfly effect in the chaos theory I just talked about. Those little things matter, and we have to see the details of risk and the interconnectedness of risk. And that becomes critically important. So some key questions that I find that organizations should be asking right now. Does the organization have enough information to make decisions about the future of the company when they don't have a clear view of risk that impacts critical business operations and processes and the objectives there? Does the organization know its risk exposure at the enterprise, business process, and technology levels and how they interrelate? How does the organization know it is managing and mitigating risk effectively in the context of the business to achieve business goals? Can the organization accurately gauge the impact of risk on business strategy, objectives, and operations? Does the organization get the information it needs to take timely action to risk exposure to avoid or mitigate loss in situations of non-compliance? Does the organization monitor risk indicators across key IT systems, processes, and information? And does the organization optimally measure and model risk in a business context? My experience is that a lot of organizations are quite lacking in their answers to these questions. Now, enterprise risk management. It's a difference between operational risk management and enterprise risk management. In the webinar in a few weeks, I'll be talking about the differences between business and operational resiliency. The same thing with enterprise and operational risk, and they're closely related there. Enterprise risk management includes operational risk, but it's much broader. These are not synonyms. Enterprise risk management is not a synonym for operational risk management. Enterprise risk management is greater than operational risk management, but includes operational risk management. So enterprise risk management is going to look at the strategic risks of the organization and the strategy. It's going to look at the operational risks. It's going to look at the compliance and regulatory risks, reputational risks, conduct risks, market risks, insurable risks, the credit risk, and liquidity and cash risks of the organization. All these are critical in developing enterprise risk management strategy to get 360-degree contextual insight and awareness of risk. And operational risk is just a piece of this, but a critically important piece. And actually, even though I label operations, several of these fall into operations, like compliance and regulatory, reputational, conduct risk. A lot of these times they're operational risks. Even a credit risk can be an operational risk. Maybe we've overextended ourselves with credit, but we find out the reason is people aren't paying attention to the credit policy and extending credit out to people that they shouldn't. And so it's an interconnected risk environment. So new paradigms in enterprise risk management. We're moving from a past of very reactive approaches to risk management to a future of of integrated enterprise risk management to be able to see the full perspective. And in the next 5 slides, I'm going to go through 5 new paradigms and things that I'm seeing in enterprise risk management. So the very first one that we're going to talk about is this area, getting trigger happy here, quantitative risk analysis, focusing on risk quantification. Now, you might say this is not a new paradigm because we've been doing risk quantification for decades, things Monte Carlo analysis and Bayesian modeling. And definitely people that have mature structured risk programs and in some industries like large financial services firms, this is not new. But across industries and organizations of all sizes, this is fairly new. Up till now, a lot of enterprise risk management programs have been very happy with their heat maps and some type of qualitative approach to risk of red, yellow, green, and high, medium, low. That's very subjective and not objective. And now I'm seeing a lot of RFPs and decisions being made on technology and strategy and process that require risk quantification, such as Monte Carlo analysis, and being able to show risk distributions and model risk and overall impact and where it's not likelihood, but it's actually probability. I remember working on an RFP for a large beverage manufacturer, and the chief risk officer was talking to vendors, and this vendor came in with a heat map, and on one axis it had impact, and the other axis it had said probability, and of course had high, medium, low, as far as the axis ranges on this heat map. And the chief risk officer threw the vendor out, said, "You don't understand risk management. What you're presenting is likelihood. It's a subjective, qualitative approach. And what you have on this axis, it says probability, and that's not what matches. Probability is a mathematical representation between 0 and 1. And you're not measuring that in what you're delivering here, so you don't really understand risk management, so we're not going to look at you anymore." I actually encountered that in RFP. But risk quantification, actual probability, and impact in dollars and cents or pounds or whatever currency you're using. And we're seeing this across industries. I'm interacting with a firm out of Dubai that wants Monte Carlo analysis, and they're in the hospitality, retail, property management space. There's several firms I'm interacting with in Germany, and Germany's got the IDW PS340 standard, which requires risk quantification, normalization, and aggregation. And it's changing a lot of risk management programs out of Germany. So one of those paradigms is we're seeing an increased focus on risk quantification. The other thing that we're seeing in the market out there with organizations looking for solutions is accountability, risk accountability. There's a difference between accountability and responsibility. Responsibility I can outsource. I can take tasks and give them to somebody else to do. But accountability you cannot outsource. The buck stops here. I'm accountable. If things go wrong, I have to pay up. I'm the one that is accountable in this area. And so we're seeing a whole swath of what we call accountability regimes, accountability regulations. It started at the United Kingdom Senior Managers Regime Certification Regime. That has unfolded into Ireland's Senior Executive Accountability Regime, Australia's Banking Executive Accountability Regime, Hong Kong's Managers in Charge Regime, and now Singapore's Individual Accountability Regime, where senior management functions are actually accountable for areas of risk. If there's willful wrongdoing, they could go to jail. If there's negligence or lack of due diligence, they can be personally fined. Barclays' CEO was fined £640,000 for a whistleblower infraction that the CEO had to pay out of his personal bank account, not the bank's bank account. And so we're seeing a greater accountability, risk accountability being put on boards of directors and senior management functions within organizations for accountability and risk management. I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan, J.R. Tolkien. I've likened these accountability regulations to the one ring in Lord of the Rings. You had the one ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the enforcement bind them. This is the Uber regulation for accountability for risk. You have the one regulation to rule them all, one regulation to find them, that is all the other regulations, and one regulation in the enforcement to bind them. And so we're seeing a greater focus on risk accountability. From there, the third paradigm that we're looking at is front office first line engagement, bringing risk management out of the back office. The second line function, we talk about the three lines, formerly three lines of defense. You had the first line, second line, and third line. The first line was considered operational management. The second line was the back office functions of risk and compliance and IT security. And third line was the role of internal audit and assurance functions. Now, I'm seeing time and time again that organizations still see, that back office second line function of risk is still critically important to provide collaboration and insight to risk. But risk is being taken day in and day out at the front line, the first line. And it's not just operational management, but it goes all the way down to the frontline employee. I mean, in this picture here, you have a call center. And so you've got the people in the call center that are making risk decisions every day on things like privacy and patient information, on healthcare or financial information and things. So you've got the call center risk. You've got the doctor and nurse in the hospital making patient safety and patient privacy decisions every day. You got the teller at the bank that's dealing with fraud, cash handling, money laundering, customer privacy day in and day out. How do we engage all levels of the organization in risk management? That's become critical, not just the back office, but the front office. There's at a large insurance firm in the United Kingdom, I've had several interactions as they're restructuring their enterprise risk management program. And one of the key things that they're looking for in their next generation technology is very modern, intuitive user experience to engage the front office. They want all the deep analytics and risk modeling capabilities for the back office, but they absolutely require that there be an intuitive, simplified, straightforward user experience for the first line front office to engage on risk management. And we're starting to see that come up quite often. Now, the fourth paradigm that I'm seeing as a shift in risk management is the area of creative risk thinking. Risk management requires both left brain and right brain thinking. Now, historically, risk management's been more about the left brain. We have logical and structured thinking about risk management. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle said, "It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts." Now, logical, structured, left brain thinking on risk is great. It's needed, and that's why we build risk models and can do Monte Carlo analysis and have structured approaches to risk management. But that's not enough. What we're seeing time and time again, and the COVID-19 just proved this point again, is that in addition to the left brain thinking, we need right brain thinking, creative and imaginative thinking about risk management. And Alvin Toffler said, you can use all the quantitative data you can get, but you still have to distrust it and use your own intelligence and judgment. And what I'm saying is we need a balance of both. We need both left brain and right brain thinking on risk management. It's the right brain thinking that, looks at the models and says, well, this model's good, but here's where it breaks down. Have we thought of this, this, and this? When this risk happens, our models is sort of a closed system, but it can actually impact these other risks and risk models that we have, like COVID-19, the domino effect of risks and other risk areas that I went through. We need to have creative thinking. Where a left brain thinker might want to leverage and use something like a Monte Carlo analysis, a right brain thinker might want to use a bow tie risk assessment and more of a visual aids to risk management. And good risk management requires both in today's navigating chaos business environment. And finally, the fifth paradigm in what we're seeing in enterprise risk is focus on business and operational resilience. And this is requiring that we understand what business resilience is and how it differs from operational resilience. And it's just like enterprise and operational risk I just talked about a few minutes ago. Business resilience is going to look at the strategic resilience, the liquidity and cash resilience, the cultural and integrity resilience of the organization, as well as the operational resilience. Operational resilience is just one component of broader business resilience. But resilience requires this integrated approach of risk management with business continuity. And I've been saying for years, for at least 15 years, I don't understand why these business continuity and disaster recovery functions are completely separate, disconnected from the enterprise and operational risk management functions. They should be one and the same. And I like several of the definitions on operational resilience that we have out there from regulators, and there's several that I do not like. But the ones that I do like really talk about operational resilience being an outcome of effective risk management. And so resilience is more than just business continuity 2.0. It's this integration and being led by risk management. And if that interests you more, stay tuned. The next webinar in this series in 3 weeks, we're going to unpeel and dig right into business and operational resilience. So let's bring this to forward and wrap this up. I went through those 5 trends of, the quantitative risk analysis, risk accountability, front office, first line engagement on risk, creative risk thinking by bringing in right brain thinking, not just left brain thinking, and resilience in risk management. Now, how do we improve our enterprise risk management programs in this context? First is we have to have processes and facilities in place to be able to monitor both the external and internal context, to be able to navigate the chaos of the modern business environment, where we can monitor shifts in industry practices and geopolitical and economic risks and shifts in technology and regulations and things, as well as shifts in the internal environment and strategy that impacts our risk program, to our risk tolerances, what's acceptable and unacceptable risk, and risk appetite is a term we often hear, the overall risk culture and how risk is understood and engaged out there, the training communication on risk reporting and risk management and risk ownership. We need to be able to constantly be monitoring the environment. From there, risk management is about collaboration and facilitation on strategy, process, and technology. The reality is there's lots of departments of risk management. You might have a chief risk officer. You might be a chief risk officer on this webinar. But are you really managing all aspects of risk yourself? First off, I would say you're probably not managing it because there's risk owners out there to manage it. You're probably facilitating communication and analysis on the risk and communication and coordinating the overall strategy on risk. But, good risk management is going to be able to collaborate and facilitate risk discussions across functions. You have human resources risks, you have supply chain risks, you have IT, information, cybersecurity, digital risks, whatever you want to call it. You got environmental risks, you have health and safety risks, you have quality risks, you have conduct and ethics and compliance risks, you have legal risks. Strong enterprise risk management is going to be about collaboration and bringing together these different departments to have this facilitation and collaboration on risk management and be able to see these relationships across the business. It means we have to have a top-down approach where we develop our enterprise risk management strategy. And I've actually reviewed enterprise risk management policies and charters and structures that help define and form these strategies. From building that facilitation and collaboration at that strategic level across these departments and functions led by a chief risk officer or somebody of similar responsibilities. Then from there, defining what are our risk management processes, from risk identification to risk assessment analysis to risk reporting and monitoring and treatment. And then what's the right information technology architecture to support risk management in your organization? Which is this slide. Is you need to have the right insight and contextual understanding of risk in your organization. Risks, whether they're strategic, operational, or financial risks, they have a direct relationship to objectives. In fact, as I've already stated, if we use the ISO 31000 definition of risk, risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Risk isn't done in this little silo without context. To have context for risk, we have to understand what are the objectives. They could be entity level objectives, division, department, process, project, asset level objectives. But in order to do a risk assessment, we have to have context of what we're assessing. And if we use the ISO 31000 definition of risk, a risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And so what are the objectives of whatever we're doing an assessment on? And what's our risk to achieving those objectives? What is this risk what is an impact? Is it an entity level of risk? Is it a process risk? Is it an asset level risk like GDPR violation or CCPA violation of individual information? Are there regulatory and contractual obligations around this risk? What are the policies? Every policy in your environment is actually a risk document. There wouldn't be a policy if there wasn't a risk. And that risk was significant enough that somebody had to codify and write down rules to address this risk and write it into a document and publish it as a policy. But very few organizations have mapped their policies to their risks. Be able to map your roles. Who owns the risk? Who's the subject matter expert on the risk? Be able to manage the issues, incidents, cases, events, investigations, complaints. This is where risk is materialized. And we have our risk models. Are those models actually build on accurate historical information that says in the past, this is how many times this risk is materialized in the organization in these scenarios, and this has been the impact, where we have structured, quantified data to make our risk analysis and assessments objective and avoid the subjectivity in them. And controls are put in place to mitigate risks. We have 4 options when we deal with a risk. We can accept the risk as it is. We can avoid the risk by making a decision where there's no longer a risk. We can transfer the risk like through hedging and insurance. Or the one we focus on most often is mitigation of the risk by implementing controls. Are those controls out there and operational and effective? We need a strong information architecture that can understand and see all these relationships and manage this in the organization. So, in that context, organizations should be looking to build agile risk management to be able to deliver the benefits of 360-degree contextual awareness of risk management in your organization. Agile risk management helps us become more aware because we understand risks, how they interconnect, the tree and the forest. We see the interconnectedness of risk relationships in the big picture and how those small things can impact and become a big thing. This allows us to align our resources and have aligned processes for risk identification, assessment and analysis and monitoring and treatment. That allows us to be more responsive, to be able to find risk issues and contain them before they become big risk issues. That allows us to be more agile in a dynamic and changing business environment that gives us a competitive advantage over our competitors. That also enables us to be more resilient, and so that when something like a COVID-19 hits us in multiple ways from a risk management perspective, we're prepared and we know how to deal with that risk because we've thought through scenarios and we've addressed this and we've planned for it. And in that context, we can be more efficient in our use of human and financial capital resources. So where are you today? I have a couple steps here on planning your success in future in risk management. It starts with understanding your current state. How is your organization managing risk today, enterprise risk? What's working, what's not working? And I'd like 3-year plans. Where does your organization want to be in 3 years from now? And then what's your journey to get there? Like the graphic here. You're on this mountain, you're trying to get over that mountain. Your current state and what's your future state? From there, it's important to get the right people on board. You have the role of the chief risk officer or function, maybe not that title, but you've got compliance and legal risks. You've got human resources risks. You have environmental and health and safety risks and quality risks and IT security risks. What are the right teams and collaboration across the enterprise to help achieve that future state and develop a comprehensive approach to enterprise risk in your organization? From there, you want to pick the right equipment. You don't want to start climbing up a mountain to find out that you only have enough rope to get you halfway and you got to go back down. You need to make sure that you understand what your current state is, but also that future state 2 or 3 years out from now, and what's the right technology architecture to enable that strategy and processes to get you to that future state. Nothing is worse than a project that 6 months into it, a year into it, you find that you've got to start all over again and go and ask for more money because you started with the wrong technology that couldn't deliver on what your future state was trying to get you to. Maybe you have a risk solution in play now. And it only does qualitative risk analysis like heat maps and things. And your future vision requires Monte Carlo, quantitative risk analysis. Why are you starting off with the wrong risk technology and putting in all these processes and information to find out you're going to have to scrap it all to achieve your future state? Select the technology that's going to deliver of where you're going so you don't have to switch vehicles in the middle. The other thing that's important is to plan your journey. You climb Mount Everest too fast, you die. You've got to climb up to the first base camp and let your body acclimate to that altitude before you're ready your body's physically ready to get to the next level. Enterprise risk management is complex, it's intricate, it involves a lot of different departments. And you need to plan your strategy in stages of improvements, and you just can't tackle it all in once. It's not like you're gonna like flip a light switch and enterprise risk management's working perfectly where it wasn't before. You've got to plan your journey and tackle your milestones and stages ahead of time. And from there, understand that your journey is never over. There's something like COVID-19. Next month it could be an asteroid from outer space or aliens or something. There's always global risks and things that are impacting our organizations, geopolitical risks, but also things like mergers and acquisitions, where it completely restructures the business, and we've got to address things. So once complete, your journey is really not over. You got to be prepared for the next project that impacts risk, because risk is constantly evolving and changing in our organizations. So with that, Simon, I'm going to turn this back to you to lead us through some time of discussion and Q&A.
Michael, thank you very much indeed for that. Really interesting presentation. Hopefully that's prompted some interesting thoughts amongst the audience. We've had some questions coming through. Please do feel free to keep sending your questions through. Okay, we'd like to move on now to discuss some of the points that Michael raised there, and really just cover a couple of topics sort of fairly broadly. And the first one, Michael, is the first topic is the whole sort of subject of interconnectedness of risk, the tree and the forest, and so on. I just wondered if you'd seen good examples where interconnectedness of risk is being managed effectively, and whether any industries are better than others at the moment.
Well, there's several ways to respond to that. I actually am a fan of what we're seeing in Germany right now from a regulatory standpoint with the IDW PS340 standard, because that requires risk normalization, aggregation, and reporting at a high level of the organization that gets a board level attention. And so we're seeing maturity in risk management because of things like that. As far as approaches, I mean, I can't comment on the risk management program today, but I remember a decade back, being fascinated by Microsoft's risk management program. Brad Jewett at the time was the risk manager, the chief risk officer there, the risk director, and he had this whole approach that he called the rhythm of risk. And he said, I can count on that over the course of a year, we're going to do this risk assessment. I mean, it might be a privacy risk assessment, a supplier risk assessment, whatever it might be. We have the routine risk assessments and things that come up. But I'm going to dedicate a certain amount of my resources to understanding the strategic risks of the organization. And I'm going to monitor the board and executive calendar to really determine, what's on their agenda. If they're talking about operations in China or wherever it might be, or a merger and acquisition or an expansion or something like that, I'm going to give them contextually relevant risk information that aligns specifically to the agenda and what they're discussing. And I'm going to have resources dedicated to providing, and analyzing risk in context of what's on the board and executive calendars and agenda, so they always have that contextual intelligence and insight that is specifically related to their agenda discussion on and the risks in that agenda. And I found that to be a really interesting approach. I'm not sure exactly how Microsoft's doing that today, but years back I know that it was how it was working.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Sort of related point, really. And that is that controls are clearly one of the primary ways to manage risk. I just wondered how much integration you see between risk management and controls assurance and compliance. We see quite a lot of interrelated frameworks that need to be complied with, and the sort of technologies addressing that and so on. But if you have a weak control, you've potentially got a non-compliance, but you've also got potentially a higher risk. So do you see much integration between controls assurance and compliance to really provide sort of useful views into risk?
Definitely, but I think we need to understand that risk is more than that. Risk is the ability to reliably achieve objectives. And so if we take the definition of risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. We first start with the objectives, we then measure the risk, and then we can define controls to mitigate the uncertainty in achieving those objectives. And so all three are important. But I mean, there's also other risk actions that can be taken. It's not just the controls, but we also have risk acceptance. You know, there's a certain level where we have enough controls on the risk, because there's a point that we introduce more risk by over controlling a risk. And so what's the optimal level of controls to address that risk and to keep it in balance? Because there can be a point where we over control a risk where the cost of the controls doesn't justify the risk. And we also have the area of risk transfer and insurance, and being able to make sure we have the right hedging as well as insurance policies and practices to cover risk too. So controls are one aspect, but they're a critical aspect. And controls should be mapped to risks and be able to understood in the context of the risks.
Okay, perfect, thank you. You talked about having the right equipment for the journey. What do you see as the key requirements for technology platforms to support interconnectedness of risk?
To be able to see a complete view of risk, I mean, a lot of solutions out there are built for one area of risk, like IT security, and they try to market enterprise and operational risk, but they sort of fall down because everything's sort of like through an IT lens. You know, we need solutions that have robust information architectures that can properly understand the different types of risks and the modeling of those risks in the organization, and have the right information architecture to map those risks together, because, you know, we've seen how a health and safety risk can impact an IT security risk, for example, where these departments really didn't talk too much to each other in the past. In this context, you know, we need good risk reporting and dashboards. And the risk quantification, like the Monte Carlo analysis and things, is something that's coming up very often. But then also the engagement, you know, intuitive user experience that is good not just for the back office risk functions, but also the front office.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Michael. Well, thanks very much. There are clearly some issues around risk interconnectedness there for the audience to consider.
Yep.
Okay. Michael, left brain, right brain thinking, that interests me. It's always appeared to me that sort of traditional qualitative approaches to risk assessment, where a human gives us subjective opinion on risk, is difficult.
You know, Simon, I want to get into left brain, right brain, because I'm fascinated by that area. But, you know, just in context of the last question, I mean, you come from a different perspective than I do. What are you and Acuity seeing as requirements from customers on this risk interconnectedness? Because, I mean, you're delivering technology in this area.
We are indeed, yes. Well, we're certainly seeing increasing requirements for holistic approaches to risk management, with visibility of different types of risk and how they interrelate, and then how you combine and aggregate into an enterprise-wide view for reporting. I think your point about everything to connect to everything else is really key. To be able to interconnect, aggregate, provide the sort of reporting that's needed. We think that people need a really strong data model, and there are three sort of key components to that: the business model, with business objectives, as you mentioned, business entities, products, services, the supply chain, partners. Also the risk model, the risks, the controls, the threats, the vulnerabilities, issues, incidents, and so on. But there's a third level as well. We refer to it as the asset model, which is the collective name for people, process, data, technology, other assets, and so on. And this third level is, in our experience, often overlooked. Yes, risk events impact on business objectives, but they quite often materialize in relation to unavailability or loss of key personnel, for example, pandemic, as you've mentioned, errors or failures in process, technology failures, loss of data through cyber attacks, that sort of thing. And all of these sort of underlying assets, if you like, are all interconnected and interdependent, and becoming more and more so. So if you don't know which processes are critical to achieving your objectives, and you don't know the dependence on people and process, then you can't really sort of properly start to understand how risks cascade, and you can't really combine and aggregate to provide an enterprise view. So in our opinion, you know, having a strong three-dimensional data model where everything's linked to everything really is the building block for being able to manage risk interconnectedness. And of course, with the appropriate analytics to combine and aggregate risk as well, which perhaps we'll come on to in a second. Just moving on then quickly then to left brain, right brain thinking. I was just going to ask you, I've always thought that it was difficult when we're asking business managers to assess inherent and residual risk. That's actually a very difficult thing for people to do, particularly if they haven't been trained. And I just wondered if you had any sort of thoughts about that, or tips on how to get the right balance between left brain and right brain thinking when you're asking people to identify and assess material business risks.
I mean, it's getting people that can think outside the box. And so, I mean, it's having the right people in the back office functions that can do left brain thinking in the structured models and analysis of risk. But then, you know, some of the creative risk thinkers that might be not have more of a numbers and finance background to think creatively about risk and how it can unfold and impact the organization. And bringing those together. And I think, you know, the key element here is whoever is that chief risk officer or that person, that role, if not the title, you know, it needs to be a good facilitator to make sure that there's good balanced thinking on risk management that includes both left brain and right brain thinking. I think that's what's critically important. But it's also about listening to the business. You know, a lot of times we have our structured models on risk and things in the back office, but there's people out there that work in those processes and things where risk materializes, and they know where things can break down or go wrong and how to navigate the system and things. And so it's also about engaging the business and saying, you know, if you saw things failing here, or, you know, whether it's malicious or accidental and things like that, how can it go wrong? Where can it go wrong? What should we be thinking about? And then I think it's also paying attention to some of the external environment, like the World Economic Forum reports and other things that talk about risks. And we might see those at a macro level, like the systemic failures and things you maybe will see in the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, but be able to think about how does this unfold and impact me at a business level. So if there is a pandemic, you know, which we've seen now, how does that impact me as an or impact the organization? And what do we do about it? And then part of that whole question that also comes into play is risk velocity. You know, the speed of onset of a risk as well as the time to recover from a risk. Two dimensions of risk velocity I think are important there. But you know, it really requires thinking around and collaboration and understanding how do these creative risks impact the models. The models are good to provide a structured approach, but models aren't perfect. I mean, the real world is very complex. It's chaotic, with a lot of interconnections, and models can be accurate to a degree, but there's times where they themselves fail because of the complexity of the environment in the world.
Okay, perfect, thank you. I'm just conscious of the time. I can't believe how quickly that hour has passed. So I'm just going to move on now from the discussion. Quickly to point out that there are some additional resources on the portal to support this presentation. There's a brochure on our platform. There's also a bias checklist for GRC and integrated risk management, if anybody would like to download those. In terms of our stream platform, we support a wide range of applications as summarized on the slide here, and our webinar coming up in April will touch on some of these. There's a lot of information available on our website, also including data sheets on each of those applications. All of the webinars that we've recorded, you can see on the website as well. If you'd like a demonstration of the platform before April the 7th, then please do contact us. And of course, there are white papers on the website as well. So just to recap on some dates that are coming up: March the 24th, delivering business and operational resiliency with Michael, and then April the 7th, the future of GRC stream in action. That just leaves me a couple of minutes for some questions that have come through. If I don't answer your question, my apologies, we've run out of time, but we will come back to you directly. There was one question: can you define agile risk management? That was the whole subject of the first webinar actually that we ran in this series. Michael, would you like to say in 30 seconds a definition of agile risk management?
I mean, agile risk management is aiming to be more efficient, effective, and agile in our risk processes so that we can navigate chaos more effectively in the organization. It's very much like the Microsoft approach I talked about just a few minutes ago. Being able not only to look at, the routine elements of risk, but look at what's happening in the environment around us, what's happening with the board and executives and their calendars and the strategic direction, and to leverage and use risk management as a tool to be able to navigate uncertainty in the organization for a more effective return in the organization. If risk management is very effective, it enables business agility as well as resiliency, and they're different but related. Agility, helps us. It's like parkour in France. I mean, if you've seen that whole parkour thing where people like jump around buildings and things like that, that's a great thing of agility, being able to react to the environment and be very agile. Resilient is when bad things happen, to be able to be resilient and weather that storm. And both are important. They're both related. It's almost like a yin and yang thing. I think that's the visual that I see is agility is that what we're talking about. There's agility, one aspect, maybe the white part of it, the yin, and then the yang, and the black part is the resilience. I mean, they're closely related, but it's to be able to quickly react and make the right decisions.
Great, thank you. And just one final question I think we perhaps have time for, if we can just squeeze that in. And that's related really, I think, in how does the organization know what to ask if the risk has not been addressed before? That feels to me like a requirement for looking at resilience. But Michael, how would you answer that?
Say that once more.
How does the organization know what to ask if the risk has not been addressed before?
You need to be able to put it in a business context, and I think scenarios is the great way to unfold that, and say we're looking at this risk, and giving this risk unfolding, it can impact us in this type of scenarios. Like a human virus is an excellent example, or even a computer virus. But you have a human virus like COVID-19, and it can be sort of slow in spreading. It can be very quick in spreading. Is it more of a regional, containable thing, or is it something that's global? And so we look at the risk, and we look at the different scenarios and how it can unfold and impact the organization, and the unfolding risks from there as well, the interconnectedness of risk, to become up with a better understanding of it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Michael. I think we do have a fairly hard stop, so I'm going to close it here. If we haven't answered your questions, we will come back to you outside of this session and answer those. And very much hope that you can join us again in 3 weeks' time to talk about resiliency. Okay, so with that, I'll close it. Thank you very much.